Great. Well, thank you, Scott. Um, so Scott Reynolds and I have been putting on these programs along with all of Mary and Friends meeting for 2.5 or 3 years now, I think. So it started during the pandemic, like so many of these sorts of things started. But the instigating factor behind it was our fundraising campaign for our preservation project that we're having for Mary and Friends meeting. So Mary and Friends meeting was founded in 1682, and the meeting house was built relatively recently in 1695. So we have been around for what is that, 341 years, I think. So it's we are a strong but mighty religious force in Lower Merion. We are on the National Historic Register, or we are a National Historic Landmark, excuse me, one of only 2,600 in the entire country, which gives some status to the importance of Mary and Friends meeting, not only architecturally, but in the founding of our country. William Penn visited Mary and Friends meeting, and a lot of the principles that he incorporated into his Charter of Rights are what the basis of our country is founded on. We have just completed raising $90,000 for our preservation campaign, and what we were able to do with that is to have these talks, but also to pay for a preservation architect to look at all of our buildings. And actually, Dan Campbell, our preservation architect, is on the call here today with us. Hey, Dan. And he led a team of experts, engineers, architects, and other folks to develop a plan to look at all of the buildings and site walls and everything, the burial ground at our corner of Montgomery Avenue and Meeting House Road, and come up with a plan for what needs to be done and with some price figures on it. And so all we need to do is raise $5 million now, and we should be in the pink. So we do have some pretty lofty goals. But as I was mentioning, that these Know Thy Neighbor talks was initially just to let people know about our fundraising campaign. But we really want to reach out to our neighbors more and just be more of a presence in the community. We're kind of up on the hill a little bit, and it's a little difficult to see the building when you're driving by with the retaining wall there that collapsed 4 years ago. We started with preservation talks, historic and preservation talks, but we've expanded it, and along with Laura Jackson's help, we have included a lot of social justice conversations as well. So we have these talks every 2 months. We try to have them every 2 months. And we've flipped between history and preservation and social justice. So if you take a look at our website or our Facebook page, you should be able to see upcoming talks. But we are thrilled to have Mike Weilbacher with us. Mike has been a friend of Mary and Friends meeting for well over 20 years. He's a writer, a naturalist, and an environmental educator with 40 years of experience teaching through lectures, walks, newspaper essays, theatrical performances, and radio. He's the former executive director of the Schuylkill Center for Environmental Education in Philadelphia, and he is well known to radio listeners as Mike, the all-natural science guy on the award-winning live children's radio show Kids Corner on WXPN, where he's been talking to children about nature and the environment for more than 30 years. As the former executive director and a Lower Merion resident, I might add, of the Lower Merion Conservancy, he visited Mary and Friends to help us ceremonially wish our beloved American sycamore tree farewell. And that is the cross section of the tree that is now in our activities building. But that was a centennial tree that the township took down because of it was dying, and it was a danger to Montgomery Avenue. And we had a little farewell ceremony, and Mike was kind enough to be our guest speaker for that event well over 20 years ago now. And he featured Mary and Friends meeting in many of the Lower Merion Conservancy's historic preservation talks and events. His first book, Wild Philly, featuring tons of information about Philadelphia's environment, highlights 29 walks to take in the region, and has just been released on Timber Press. And I'm sure Mike will be telling us a little bit more about that. But I really want to welcome Mike Weilbacher, who has been an environmental force in the community for many years and a friend to Marion Meeting and to me personally. So thank you, Mike.
Oh my gosh, thank you. Thank you, Ross, and thank you, Scott. Thank you for setting this up. Thank you, everybody. It's so good to see you and good to see some old friends here on the Zoom tiles. And Ross, now you can see my slides, right? Beautiful. And that was a wonderful moment for me and my family to come to Marion Friends back in the day and say goodbye to the sycamore tree. My daughters from now in their 20s and 30s came along, and Molly, who was then 5 or 6 at the time. The service had begun. We're 10 minutes in. Nobody has said anything. Molly taps me on my leg and says, "Daddy." I said, "Yeah, Molly. When does it start?" I said, oh, it already has. I didn't give her the preamble on what to expect in a Quaker service. So it was lovely to be with you then. It's great to be back right now. But we're going to dive into this wonderfully complicated topic, hotter, wetter, wilder, weirder. There we go. Climate change in Philadelphia. And speaking of wilder, as Ross mentioned, my book, Wild Philly, has just come out. I'm so excited, only 2 months ago. And the last 2 months, it's held its place #1 in Philadelphia travel books on Amazon.com, which is really funny. But yeah, it's got 29 walks. But to get to the 29 walks, there's a section of 101 species you should know, biographies of those species. And there's a team of naturalists from across the region that worked with me on which species should be in the book and which walks you should go on. And then we also line the walks up. So essentially they're calendarized by spring, summer, fall, winter. So you've got a whole year of walks. 25 in the region, 4 farther afield, like Hawk Mountain. When the hawks are migrating, Pine Barrens east of us, got to be in the Pine Barrens, of course. So anyway, 25 walks. And then there's 10 small chapters on history, plants, animals, geology, the Lenape story. Of course, William Penn is all over the history chapter. Why did he found Philadelphia where he did? Why is it where it is today? That whole story is there. Inga Saffron, the wonderful architecture critic for the Philadelphia Inquirer, calls William Penn, surprisingly, but maybe not, if you think about it, the first developer in the New World, America's first developer. So check out Wild Philly. Get it, anywhere you get books. Narberth Bookstore they've been thrilled because there's been a run at Narberth Bookstore. So grab it from them. But we're going to dive instead into climate change. And it's an incredibly timely talk. Here is a story from the Inquirer earlier this week. Hot time. So I'm sitting here in April in a t-shirt it's in the 80s right now. So April is prime season here for dry heat, wildfires, and hay fever. So if you look at the photograph below it, that's the Pine Barrens from earlier in the week as well. So there's been a big fire in the west, not California. We often hear of wildfires. Fort Lauderdale in Florida had 2 feet of rainfall in one day. So when 24, 25 inches of rain falls in one day, that tends to capture your attention. Alabama went through a big spout of tornadoes in January. January is not tornado season, and tornadoes only come from a lot of heat in the atmosphere. So when you've got a whole bunch of tornadoes coming on one place in January in what's supposed to be a winter-ish or at least cool-ish, that gets your attention. And I'm sure I've been following the story out west where California, which seems to be the epicenter of all things climate change. Those poor people there are just buffeted by everything. But this atmospheric river system just battered them all year. After an epic drought, they have just been flooded with rainfall after rainfall after rainfall after rainfall, storm after storm after storm, like a parade of storms. So that some places up in the mountains in the west gotten something like 17 feet of snow and more. So it's been just a wild winter out west, but we expect the wildfire season to kick in again soon. The These are the kinds of photographs you come to expect in climate change conversations. The ice caps, the struggle that they're having, the struggles that polar bears are having. Consequently, Greta Thunberg, who of course makes a lot of waves as a young kid, advocating against climate change, or for fixing climate change. There we go. So those are the kinds of things you expect. And then these are the kinds of conversations that the culture has been having. So while we could have been having a 40-year conversation on climate change and want to do it, we just keep getting distracted by other things. And this political cartoon is only 2 years old, but essentially it holds true today. So I didn't change it out. Different things tend to obsess us, and we just keep getting distracted from the conversation we should be having. So there is the issue on the left, and there's our response thus far on the right. And given it is 2023, I just never expected that culturally we'd be in this place at this time. So I want to dive into this, but first, would love to just share some questions with you, sort of climate change 101. So, you know, for me, it's important that people understand how many parts per million of carbon dioxide might be in the air, right? So this is like background baseline information. So you've got 3 numbers, just park in your head which of those 3 numbers you think might be the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere right now. And then when we go through the talk, we'll see if you're right. Which season is changing the fastest? So of those 3 center seasons, which one is changing more rapidly than the others? Here in Philadelphia. Philadelphia's largest precipitation events have increased by what % recently? We'll find out what a large precipitation is again. Again, think to yourself, remember those? And by 2100, on the present course, if we don't change course, Philadelphia's climate will most closely resemble which American city? And you've got 3 choices: Richmond, Atlanta, Brownsville. The cardinal behind me is weighing in with his thoughts, so I'm not sure if you can hear him or not, but we have an insistent cardinal in our backyard. Hope you don't mind. And then, you know, 2022 was only the 6th warmest year on record. And if you look, and a lot of the data I'm getting to you is from Climate Central, a nonprofit that specializes in good climate information like this and great infographics as well. They're based in Princeton. But check this out. If you look at the hottest years, this is, you know, we've been keeping records of temperature for 150 years. And the hottest year, 2016. Number 2, 2020, then 19, 17, 15, 22, 21, 18, 14, and inexplicably 2010. So, my apologies. So, all of the 9 of the hottest 10 years on record are in the last decade, and the 10th, literally the 10th, is only in 2020. So there's no other year outside of that, which is pretty crazy when you think about it. So as some background science, once upon a time, not too long ago, the Earth had something like 280 parts per million of carbon dioxide. So you might have remembered back in middle school when you did how much gas, you know, which concentration of which gases were in the atmosphere, and you might have had a quiz on this, right? Like 80% of the atmosphere is nitrogen, almost 20% would then be oxygen, and then little bits and pieces would be the remainder things. So carbon dioxide was only 280 parts per million. I think the number that I learned back in middle school was 0.003%. 0.003% of the atmosphere. So that's that 280 parts per million rounded up. So it's not a whole lot in the atmosphere, but the number becomes important because from the burning of fossil fuels, if you measure the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere today, 421. Oh, I have to change my quiz. It's increased. 421 up from 420. So we now have 421 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. This is an increase in 50% from the average before the Industrial Revolution. So because of the burning of fossil fuels over the last 200 years, we've increased global concentrations of CO2 by 50% to 421 parts per million. And if you graphed that carbon dioxide change against a graph of global temperatures, look at the nice way they parallel each other. Of course, you have to work on adjusting the ranges of the two y-axes to get them to line up, but nonetheless, it's pretty straightforward. When CO2 rises, it looks like temperatures rise. So the two are happening simultaneously. And then this is a little bit hard to read, but if you look at this timeline, you can see the arrow points to the 1950, roughly around, when the industrial revolution is really heating up, when cars are really starting to move, right? So there's that line across the whole thing is the 300 parts per million. And then if you look, it goes back more than 400,000 years. Carbon dioxide over 400,000 years has never been above that magical 300 parts per million until just look at the last couple of years. So we are essentially in this massive experiment right now where we've supercharged CO2 all the way up here with unknown consequences. And if you saw Al Gore's movie, you saw similar graphs like that. What I want to focus on Philadelphia and what I've worked really hard at is accumulating information about what specifically will happen in Philadelphia in regards to climate change. So how does our fair city fare under climate change? And here's Hurricane Ida from 2 Labor Day weekends ago, which just really was an epic rainstorm for us. And I love this photograph because it says, in some ways, yes, we are literally going the wrong way now with climate change. But there is, 676, the Vine Street Expressway, underwater. People were canoeing on the Vine Street Expressway during that storm. Main Street, Manayunk, poor Manayunk got socked by record rainfall coming through the Schuylkill River. Mike's California Detailing in Manayunk is situated between the Schuylkill River on the right and the Manayunk Canal on the other side to the left, and the two were not separated. So the river overflowed its banks, overflowed the canal, went up to Main Street. So Mike's California Detailing, the store got detailed, and it's amazingly it's reopened again. Bless his heart, but I'm concerned about the future of Manayunk under climate change scenarios. Remember that same storm also generated a bunch of tornadoes here locally, and actually we had tornadoes even recently in the Philly region. So we don't get lots of tornadoes, but they do happen. But this one was in Mullica Hill and knocked out a bunch of homes. The same very powerful storm, and that's Ida's the one that actually went through Florida twice, right? And it burned through, came in, hit Florida, got bigger, and then came up the United States. That radical leftist magazine, Philadelphia Magazine, where normally you find out where the best cheesesteak is in the city a couple of years ago, actually published, if I can use a Yiddish word with you, all I plotzed when I saw this, that climate change made the cover of Philadelphia Magazine. So you know that the story has, what's a good phrase? It's increasingly in people's awareness. If Philadelphia Magazine, who's not a cutting edge, doesn't do cutting edge journalism, if they're going to put this as a cover story. Now look at William Penn there underneath water. It's not going to be like that, but they did have a lot of incredibly good information and good infographics, some of which I'm going to share with you as we move on. And then warming sadly is becoming the new normal. Again, going back to Climate Central, if you look at the decades before the 1930s, blue indicates cooler times, so it's cooler than the 20th century average, right? So Philadelphia's average for the 20th century would be 0. Anything red is an increase. So if just look at the trend over, essentially this is now more than 100 years, the trend is definitely a pretty steep increase in recent decades in warming in the city. The city's Office of Sustainability put out a report a few years ago and noticed that since 2010, Philadelphia's had the snowiest winter ever, the 2 warmest summers ever, the wettest day ever, the 2 wettest years ever, 3 hurricanes, and 2 derechos. Now, what's a derecho? Hold that thought, because we're going to come back to that. Because for me, one of the things that's intriguing about climate change, among so many things, is that it's teaching us new vocabulary, sadly. So we have to learn new words to understand climate change, and hold on to derecho. We'll come back to that. So for me, Philadelphia is getting hotter, wetter, and weirder. And we're going to start with hot and figure out how hot it's going to get as we progress through climate change. And this is for the state, a graph of statewide temperatures. And this is under 2 scenarios. The red one with higher emissions, the green one with lower emissions. The line across the graph is 0, that we're not increasing. So neither under lower nor higher emissions do we stay at 0. We're now at a place where in Pennsylvania, we're mitigating how far up we want to go. And if we really begin to lower emissions, we can get a 2-degree rise in the average temperature. If we don't, if we're not careful, look at that, it could be as high as 14. So again, these are models, these are estimates, that's a big range. And with temperature, average temperature, 1 or 2 degrees makes an amazingly big difference. The state as a whole has warmed about the same as the country as a whole, or even just a tick cooler. So we're a very forested state. So with all those trees across Pennsylvania, 2.4 degrees versus the country's 2.5. But Philly, not having the tree cover the rest of the state has, is noticeably warmer than the rest of Pennsylvania. If you look at Philadelphia this way, this is a really interesting way to do it. So each vertical line represents a year. Each year, if it's a white year, if the color is white for that year, that means that it's the average temperature for the previous, I believe it's like century. It's a very long time. So white is normal. Blue, the bluer it gets, the cooler the year was, or the less below the normal it was, the redder it gets, right? The warmer it gets. So what you might expect, if climate change was random and if it wasn't true and if it was fake news and all of that, you would expect something like you see in here, where there's normal years, warmer years, and cooler years. In fact, if you look, very cool happens way back in around 1874. So around the Civil War is the last time we had a blue, that blue. Here's a little bit of almost that blue. And we've had a couple of cool years, but look at all the red. So the red noticeably stacks up as you get into the 21st century in Philadelphia. 16.8 of 17, that's more than 2 weeks of days in the summer above normal now. This is a graphic from Fox Weather Authority. So even Fox is reporting this, right? So the most days we've ever had with 90 degrees was in 2010, when there were 55 days of 90 degrees. This 26 number is about the average in 2017, but if you look, it climbs a ladder. 2017, 26, 1 year later 30, a year later 35, 36, 37. Don't know what last year was. I need to track that down, but nonetheless, you can see a gentle rise in recent years of the number of 90-degree days in the summer. This is from Philadelphia Magazine, right? Worst case scenario predictions, the average number of days in Philadelphia above 90, currently 26, the number we mentioned historically, right? They're saying, or some models have indicated that it could be as many as 104 days above 90. That's 3 months. That's a whole summer above 90s by the year 2080. So that's a long time from now, and that's if things don't progress, but that's a really scary number. Right now, we've already added 6 more days above 95, inching towards 100. We don't typically get a day with 100 in Philadelphia, or we hadn't historically. But so look here, right? But they're saying by 2050, if current emissions continue more than 10, by 2100, again, a whole month of days above 100. So leaving summer into the fall, fall has warmed by 2.6 degrees in Philadelphia. The nights even more so, 3.5 degrees. So the nights are getting warmer than the days, which is really interesting. And what that means is that the first frost is coming later. So the first frost is more than 2 weeks later. So if you look over here, we used to get a frost historically, not unusual around Halloween. Now it's happening closer to Thanksgiving. There's that old ditty of a poem that many of you probably had to memorize back in elementary school about frost being on the pumpkin. The frost is not going to be on the pumpkin very much in Philadelphia anymore. And what this means, besides it being more uncomfortable for a lot of us sleeping at night, pollen will extend into night times through that extra heat, but that trees won't turn the colors that we've come to expect and love without those cool nights. We need the cool nights to kill the chlorophyll in the trees to reveal the other colors. If that's not happening, then the color is compromised. Or we might lose some of the fall colors that we've come to expect and love in the fall. Winter, interestingly enough, is warming even more. So while the night times in the fall is 3.6 degrees, daytime, the average for the whole day in Philadelphia has warmed almost 5 degrees above average. So we went through a whole winter now without any snowfall. Now, remember, any noticeable, so nobody had to shovel any snow. So remember, 1 year can be an aberration. 1 year is not a trend. 1 day is not a trend. One big weather event is not a trend. So we have to remember it's the accumulation of these trends. So when things stack up many times in a certain time, that's when you begin to pay attention. So again, what we're looking here is not just it happened to be a year with no snow, but look over many years and see what the snowfall is doing, and that begins to tell you what the trend is. But temperature-wise, the trend is we're 5 degrees warmer. But interestingly, that's what happens across much of the country. 2/3 of the country, the winter is warming faster than the other seasons. So winter is warming faster. Other parts of the country in different ecological zones and different meteorological zones have other seasons that are warming. We are getting warmer winters. And there is a correlation between snowfall and temperature. So as the temperature increases, the amount of snowfall decreases. So that's pretty clear. And for you, it probably makes sense too, right? This is complicated to understand, but over 126 winters starting in 1885, when the number of weather events, number of winters with snowfall above 20 inches in Philadelphia, 47 times it happened when the average temperature was below 35 degrees. Only 17 times it happened when it was higher than that. And if there are winters with less than 20 inches of snow, 16 times with lower temperature and 46 times with higher temperatures. So again, typically in Philadelphia, colder winters tend to generate more snow than warmer winters. Makes sense, but you need to look at the data to make sure it's happening. So Philadelphia Magazine talked to consultants who were worried that by 2050, if trends continued, our temperature would look like or feel like Richmond, Virginia by the year 2050, Richmond, Virginia. And then by 2100, if those trends continued, we would feel like and have temperatures similar to our sister city way down on the Mexican border in Texas, so that Philadelphia by 2100, under present trends, would have weather comparable to Brownsville, Texas, which is pretty far south of us. So that's where Philadelphia is headed. Again, the predicate is always if present trends continue. So that's a big if, right? That's the hotter. Let's look at the wetter side of Philadelphia. So again, let's go back to elementary school, maybe middle school. I didn't know the water cycle until I think high school. I think kids getting it sometimes in preschool nowadays, which is awesome. But water evaporates up into clouds. It condenses right there. It forms the clouds. And then, of course, it forms rainfall or snowfall or sleet or hail and comes down and precipitates. So it evaporates up, condenses to form clouds and precipitates down. So it makes sense, right? What goes up must come down. If the weather is warmer, we're evaporating more water, which condenses to form more clouds, which have to precipitate somewhere. And so what's happening here in Philadelphia? Average inches of precipitation per year. Again, this is Philly Mag, 42 inches historically between the 70s and 2000, 52 inches, an increase of 10 inches per year by 2080, again, if those present trends continue, right? And if you look across the United States, we're getting more days per year of 3 inches or more compared to the average. So bigger storms are happening across a big swatch of the country. This is a very gentle rise, and the 7 and 8 on the left are hundredths of inches. This is the average hourly rainfall over the course of a year. So, roughly 7/100ths or less of an inch of rain in any given hour. In 1970, we're now above 7.5. So it's a gentle increase, but headed higher. And heavy downpours are increasing across a big chunk of the Northeast, where heavy downpours have increased 71% between 1958 and 2012 when this was done. And very heavy means it's the heaviest 1% of all daily events in that time period. So it's a lot of data, but nonetheless, what that means is there's a higher probability of heavier rainfalls. When it rains, it seems to rain a little heavier nowadays. And maybe you've noticed that too. In fact, on the wettest day of the year, back in 1950, we would get like, a 2-incher, 3-incher would be the big one. Now look at the size of the heavier storms as you get into more recent years, right? We're heading up to 3 to 4 inches, and we've had some days of 6, 7, 8. So you may have noticed that we're getting bigger storms. And in fact, what's a little scary for us, really hard to read this, lots of slides. There's the 50 cities with the biggest increases in heavy downpours. McAllen, Texas, #1. Portland, Maine, #2. Surprise, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania is #3 on this list. A 360% increase. A 360% increase in heavy downpours. So we're up there. We beat New York. New York is #4. This is not something we want to beat New York in. We always are happy when we beat New York, but not for this. So there's that 100-year storm where it's like a 100-year storm is the storm that is only a 1% chance of happening on any given year. And so if you live to be 100, you should see one 100-year storm. But there seem to have been several 100-year storms over the last few years when we shouldn't have seen any. And the average 100-year storm is now defined as a storm that gives us 7.5 inches of rain. So they've upped the 100-year storm to accommodate the new reality. Again, from Climate Central, what's our biggest threats? If you look at the green dots, so there's 2 different kinds of greenish yellows. So it's a little hard to see, but in here, we're looking at precipitation where Philadelphia is. So precipitation is along in here as the biggest worry from climate change. So there are different threats in different parts of the country. Drought is not our issue, right? Precipitation is our issue with climate change. So that's hotter and wetter. For weirder, our poster child for weirder is this guy who floated down Vine Street Expressway during Hurricane Ida in an inner tube. Of course, the fecal coliform that might be in that water from combined sewer overflow. I don't know how this guy survived this trip, but nonetheless, he's drinking a beer, floating down the river that was formed on Vine Street Expressway. And again, going the wrong way. We're heading the wrong way, but this guy's our poster child for weird. So let's go into this a little bit. So here's a graphic you might see more often than you wished. we're having a severe weather week, says Channel 3, and that happens more than we wanted to. And I mentioned this list of things that we talked about before from the city's Office of Sustainability. So a derecho, I asked you to hold that thought a little bit ago, is from the Spanish word for straight ahead. And here's the skies above Philadelphia on June 3rd. So this is almost 3 years ago. They got darker and darker and darker. Derecho for me, you can almost think of it as a sideways tornado, so a tornado rolling on its side. So it's an intense storm and it moves in a straight line. And this one derecho essentially moved something like 150 miles from close to Harrisburg, almost to the Jersey Shore. It just um, and if you look on the Inquirer for the next day, the underlying part is one of the wildest days for weather in the region's history. Meteorologists were in awe of what transpired. No one could recall a day quite like that. So this derecho burned through, and it came through the Schuylkill Center's Pine Grove, which is one of the most treasured sites. At the Schuylkill Center, white pine trees have a tendency to snap under high winds. And the derecho sadly aimed right for Pine Grove and took out a bunch of trees in the center. So the Pine Grove has been struggling. And now what that's done is it's opened up the forest floor below the pine trees in Pine Grove. And so we're getting invasive weeds there that we didn't used to get because the pine trees were able to shade them out. So our Pine Grove changed. But anyway, it hit across the entire region. So we have that derecho. That's the second derecho that I remember in this region in the last decade. So again, it's a word I think we didn't have to worry about in pre-climate change days. But then weirdness happens across the whole year. There was a blast of Arctic cold in November 3.5 years ago. It set a 3-day low temperature, set 3 low temperature records. So again, you got weirdness happening as the climate wildly oscillates. Things happen that you don't expect. So you get a derecho, and then you get remarkably low temperatures. So this is almost 4 years ago already. There was a day with lots of tornadoes across the state of Pennsylvania. In that 2019 was a big year, the 17th reported thus far this year. And that day was also the 12th straight day when at least 8 tornadoes touched down in the US, setting a record. So again, you don't want to look at one day as an aberration. You want to look at tornadoes over time and see if it's increasing. But we're getting increasingly interesting weather events, and even the word weird begins to sneak into straight ahead media coverage like this. What's with the weird weather? The environment offers an explanation. So the weather is getting weirder. More unexpected things are happening, not just here in Philadelphia, but across the country. And so what does all this mean? Well, from a naturalist point of view, many former southern birds have become common as their ranges have moved northward. So when I first moved to Philadelphia 40 years ago, I don't believe there were black vultures in the city. There was turkey vulture, or one species that was native here. But the black vulture, a southern bird, its range has increased northward. And luckily, turkey vultures don't seem to mind, and you can often see the two of them hanging out together. So black vultures have moved north. Carolina chickadees have moved north. Red-bellied woodpeckers have as well. So the ranges of several common birds have been expanding over time. This was an incredibly strange year for wildflowers in the region. This is at our good friend Bowman Hill Wildflower Preserve up in New Hope. This is from their site. We saw bluebells opening way earlier than normal. We had magnolias look like they wanted to start opening in February. I mean, things were just trucking along. Then we had that weird couple of weeks of where it got cool again, so things kind of put the brakes on. But it felt as if spring was ahead of itself this year by a full month at one point. So flowers have been opening at very strange times. And what happens is there's supposed to be this orchestration between the flowers that open and the pollinators that come visit them. And if the flowers and their pollinators get out of sync, then we don't know quite what that means. Also, birds begin to show up in this area, like this scarlet tanager, they're migrating north. And when they come, they're expecting to find the food that they need to survive. And if the food is out of sync, so if birds are coming before or after the insects are hatching, then we've got some trouble. So what's happening is there used to be this elegant parade of things, of events that unfolded over the course of the calendar year. And that parade has sort of been upended, and things are now happening just at random times. And there's going to be winners and losers ecologically as this all shakes out, and it's unclear at the moment what they are. The Jersey Shore, wow. I would, this is Sandy, by the way, as you probably can guess. That was quite an extreme storm. They've been lucky, but in recent years, but if, it's not like the coast hasn't been that the water hasn't been rising at the coast. Over the last 26 years, there's been 6 inches, I'm sorry, of sea level rise already at the Jersey Shore, and they're expecting over the next 13 years 6 more inches of sea level rise. And again, this is already a 6-year-old slide, so those numbers may have changed. But again, that's a foot of sea level rise in those 30, 40 years, right? And again, that's if present trends continue. And if they continue, it's going to get worse even beyond that. Here in Philadelphia, what we often forget is that the Delaware and the Schuylkill are tidal. They have high tides and low tides. And so as sea level rises across the East Coast, guess what's going to happen in the Delaware and in the Schuylkill? They're going to rise too. So there's going to be dental increases in the level of our two rivers. So I'm sorry for this slide. It's really hard to read this, but you can see that's a map of the city, and you see the colored portions of the map, especially concentrated down in South Philly, right, and along the Delaware River. So you've got a light colored green for 2 feet of sea level rise, a blue for 4 feet, and 6 feet is the darker green color. So under different scenarios, of climate change, you can expect those areas to be impacted by rising sea levels, by rising river levels. So again, especially in South Philly at the airport, right, near the airport, and all up along the Delaware, there's going to be sea level rise. No matter what we do, it's a question of mitigating the sea level rise. And if you add that same sea level rise to a large storm, these are what some of the options are. So again, look how much of the city could be underwater under radical climate change with a big storm. So that's an important piece of the story to keep in mind. And the city's Office of Sustainability, in one of their reports, issued these photographs of what the Schuylkill River looks like normally in Center City, top left. And then on the right, that was what happened during Hurricane Irene a few years back. And then below that, if you, I think we're going clockwise here. So below, here's Hurricane Irene. This is a photograph. And then this one is with moderate sea level rise. And then this one is moderate sea level rise plus a category 1. So if a big hurricane comes, there we go. And a big chunk of Center City is slightly underwater. The airport, and again, this is also from the Office of Sustainability, built right on fill along the river, right? Under sea level rise could look something like this. Under only a few feet of sea level rise, you get water right up to the wheels of the airplanes. That's only under a couple of feet of sea level rise. And FDR Park, then at South Philly, across from the stadiums, begins to disappear underwater. So for the top climate hazards, precipitation is our number 1, right? Drought, warming, and sea level rise. Well, there we are, as number 5. So again, climate central. Precipitation is our big problem, and you can see the impacts from that. It has other impacts as well. This is a heat vulnerability map. The redder the areas, the more vulnerable the people are to extreme heat. So in the Northwest, where it's so wooded, not much of an issue, but in North Philadelphia, where it is so not wooded, in South Philly and West Philly, right, some of the sections that have the least tree cover, this is where people are going to be suffering the most. And these are people who can least afford air conditioning. So, or they tend to be. So this is going to be an issue for us. And if heat vulnerability increases, then the amount of deaths related to heat also will increase. So currently, handful of deaths per million people in Pennsylvania. And then again, if we don't cut carbon emissions by 2100, we're looking at significantly higher impacts from people dying from heat, to say it honestly. And another tough graphic, and it makes sense. The hotter it is, the more violence there is. The hotter it is, the more shooting violence occurs in large cities. And like Philadelphia, more so than many other cities. So cooler years versus hotter years in the city of Philadelphia. So there's a gun violence component to climate change. And again, we're learning new language. Derecho is one new word. Climate refugee is another phrase. People who have to leave their homes because of climate change. And remember that a lot of the immigrants coming north, a lot of the immigrants coming north of the border from Central and South America are coming here because farming is failing and there's droughts. So there's a lot of political unrest too, but there's a climate change overlay to what's happening with migration from Central America into the US. So we could have in Philadelphia possibly 300,000 climate refugees by the end of the century. We rank 5th behind those cities. So the solutions part, you know a lot of them. There are no surprises. They're everywhere. The Office of Sustainability is committed for the city to drop its greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2050. That's a radical move. It's going to take a lot of things. About 1,000 things have to line up in the right way, but nonetheless, that's the commitment they've made, and they're working on it. And there have been some notable wins, but nonetheless, a lot has to change. We just can't have mass transit that looks like this. We need a different kind of mass transit. And you can see, of course, buses. You know, we still just don't want to invest in buses and trains as much as we need to. But you can see there's been a lot of movement. Just looking at the number of car commercials for electric vehicles. I mean, it's crazy. So they're finally catching on. It took a long. It took about 40 years longer than it should have, but it's catching on finally, and we're moving. So it's a question for me always is, are the solutions unlocking as rapidly as the story is degrading? That's for me, we're sort of in a race right now. So we know we need to move to different automobiles. We need more efficient energy across the board. So cities can't look like this 24/7. So we have to radically reduce the amount of energy we use as a culture. The Eagles have been leaders in green energy. There's the wind powered, and they have actually they're solar powered too. So the Eagles have been leaders in this in the NFL, thank God. But you know, we need lots of businesses across the city to buy into this new paradigm. Of course, the PES refinery in South Philly blew up famously a few years ago, and there's a big conversation about the future of fossil fuels and what we do. And right now, there's a proposal to build natural gas there, which the community is having a deep conversation about. So how do we move forward? Trees are a huge component to climate change solutions. Trees really do a lot of work. The city has a really aggressive tree planting master plan. They want to reforest the city and get to a 30% tree cover across the city of Philadelphia in a window of time. And if they do that, that'll cool the city dramatically. But that's really important. So there are efforts all across the region. Earth Day is coming up, so is Arbor Day. So help plant trees during those times. And of course, forests are amazing, right? The Schuylkill Center has 340 acres of forest, and so it's just giving off so much oxygen and absorbing so much carbon dioxide. So we need that across the city, across the region. So circling back, the amount of parts per million of carbon dioxide in the air, you all know now, 420, 421 actually. I'll change the slide. the season that's changing the fastest, winter, crazy, but large precipitation events have increased by 360% in Philadelphia. And sadly, if nothing changes, our climate will closely resemble Brownsville, Texas, which is crazy. And as Barack Obama said a few years back, we're the first generation to feel the effects of climate change and the last who can do something about it. When I first started teaching about climate change, way back in the day, longer ago than I wished, I would say things like, this is a problem for our children and grandchildren. Forget that. This is a problem for now. So what's happened is the climate is changing faster than most models have predicted. And so the action needs to happen sooner. We thought a window of opportunity, but it's a question of whether we can grab it. And politically, I think you all know we're struggling with that answer. And even if people like me are wrong, even if I am completely wrong in all of this, even though this is all database, this is all measuring, right? Right, here's a climate summit, and there's one guy in the audience. What if it's a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? These are all the spin-offs that will come. I know Laura Jackson is here, and you were talking about social justice. There's a huge social justice component to climate change solutions. I hope that we can incorporate those too. So, yeah, we'll do all these things, even if it's not true, even if nothing I'm saying is right, all these things will happen. So I really want to thank you all for the invitation to be here. I'm so grateful. Oh, this is Philadelphia during our recent storm event too, so a little bit of flooding. So I want to thank you all for your time, and good luck in the campaign to raise $5 million for one of my favorite buildings in Lower Merion. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ross. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you, Mike. Wow. I had asked people to put questions in the chat, but honestly,
Yeah.
I think we were all just completely transfixed on your presentation. So this was just fantastic. I know it's 3 o'clock and we'd said we wanted to wrap up by 3, but I think we can spend a few minutes here if there are any questions that that come up. I do have one question, Mike, and that was,
yeah, of course.
Earlier you had a slide that showed they had measured CO2 and they went back 400,000 years.
Yes.
How do you measure CO2 from 400,000 years ago?
Isn't that great? Yeah. So there are several ways, and one of the coolest ways is that they pull cores from glaciers and ice caps, ice cores. They drill down, and they know how old, when you go this far down, they know how old it is. There are bubbles of atmosphere trapped in the ice cores, and they can, I don't know how, they can measure the amount of CO2 in the bubbles.
Yeah. Wow, that is just
So, yeah,
remarkable.
there are other models for figuring out the temperature historically. That's harder because there were no thermometers 100,000 years ago. So they use tree rings and lots of other things. And now this is the thing about science that lots of people don't understand. When someone publishes a paper in science that I think that the temperature of the Earth 100,000 years ago was X, that information and their method gets pulled apart and pulled inside and out and argued about and debated and counter-suggested hundreds of times. So for something to be true in science, it has to survive those tests. So that's the trick. So even though scientists have been trying to measure the temperature of the Earth, from historically for a long time, they figured out methodologies that they all agree on that are close to correct. So that's the trick with science, is that your peers have to agree with you. And so, but the CO2 historically, because of those bubbles of the ice, that's hard to argue with. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, that really is pretty amazing. So we have a question here. I think it's related, is that how do ice ages over thousands of years fit into the narrative of climate change?
Yes. So when I took geology way back in the day, this is 50 years ago, for God's sakes, we were in a period between ice ages, right? So I was taught. So yeah, there may still be another ice age, but we're talking about that being hundreds of thousands and or millions of years in the future. So that's over geologic time. That's not over any period of time. We're talking about the next 50, 100, 200 years. So there's no ice age coming in that short window of time, but there's a question of how we all survive the next 200 years. So the ice age, that's possibly way down the road a very long time. But again, what I don't know, I'm sure somebody has written about, but I don't know. So I'm not a scientist at all. I'm a reader of science and an interpreter of science. But I don't know if CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere are going to stave off or preclude an ice age coming. Also, you'll hear critics talk about some kind of cycle. There's natural cycles to climate, and that we're just in a cycle, so it's no big deal. There's no cycle anybody has pinned down. And you saw the slides about CO2 and temperature. So it's not like CO2 has gone like this. CO2 has changed over time, but there's no cycle to CO2 that's logical, that's rhythmic, that we can point to, that has any cause. So there is no cycle behind climate change either.
So those slides were fantastic. And Climate Central, is it just climatecentral.org or?
Yeah, if you Google Climate Central, you're going to come to them right away. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it is, but I'm not 100% sure.
And that seems like a great resource. I mean, your slides
Incredible.
were they're just so clear and show these dramatic rises in all of the,
Yeah.
precipitation and heat and CO2. You can't argue with with those numbers.
Yeah, they're great. They're very helpful. And they do those infographics for any city. Plug in any city you want. You can
Oh, really?
it. Yeah.
So I have another question here is, how much can large volcanic ash eruptions? It seems like that, that's happens.
It does.
Frequently.
It does. We can't expect a volcano that's going to erupt, we don't know when, to get us out of the mess that we've created. I don't think. So they do happen. They do tend to cool things. They put a lot of stuff in the atmosphere. They have other impacts too. But I think we can't count on a volcano saving us at the last minute, unfortunately. I'm not sure if that question was hinting at that, but yeah,
well, I think it's just how does, when something happens that's so enormous and so does that impact, does it last, and does it actually have a long-term impact on our
right.
Our
I think it impacts. I don't think it lasts long. It does have an impact. But again, they're not predictable as to time or location. So they're just wild cards that are not predictable. So I think they're not helpful in the discussions. But yes, they do change the dynamics for sure.
Yeah. One other question that I missed is that the effects on farming.
Yeah.
Agriculture.
Yeah. So I know I was doing a lot of reading and working on Philadelphia, and because there's not a lot of agriculture in Philadelphia, I didn't come across much on that. But I mean, there is some, but not a lot. Obviously, I think farmers, frankly, are buffeted by climate change because what they're getting is increasingly erratic and unpredictable weather years. Farmers across the country now, I'm talking, so that you get a historic drought in California that lasts crazy numbers of years. And then suddenly this parade of river systems hits you and you get record rainfall. And so for a farmer, neither one is helpful because record rainfall just washes your farm away and record drought essentially burns your farm away. So I think farmers are increasingly troubled across the country. I'm disappointed that farmers haven't spoken up first and fastest about the issue, because you would think that they would see it And I think that's the hardest thing for me right now, to be an adult in this culture in 2023, is that to deny climate change requires a willful what? A willful ability to deny what you see by your very own eyes and feel what's happening. So we've all seen the weird weather. We felt the bigger storms. We felt the hotter days, and yet, you know, denying it at this point is just, you have to, I don't know, woo, it's a very big pill you have to take to be a climate denier these days. Apologies to anybody in the audience who's
So I think we'll take one more question, but this one is interesting. Because I don't know anything about this individual, but
Yeah.
sure you do, Mike. What do you think of Bjorn Lomberg's ideas of climate change?
Oh, I don't know this person. I'm sorry. I'll
Oh,
look that person up.
wow. Okay.
My apologies. I don't know.
That's okay. That seemed like a deep cut, but I think
Yep.
that, yeah, okay.
I'm on it.
Okay.
Our
Okay.
next thought.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. Well, thank you, Mike. I'm going to turn it over to Ross, but this really has just been a phenomenal conversation, and your presentation just really has been outstanding. So thank you so much for making the time, and thank you everybody else for joining us as well. And I'll turn it over to Ross to kind of wrap things up for the afternoon.
Okay, thank you, Scott. Mike, what a great talk, and what a scary talk at the same time. I have just one really quick question. 1% climate change a year, it doesn't really sound that much, but then when you see all the graphs, everything else is like skyrocketing. So I think maybe that might be part of the thing that lulls people into thinking it's not that bad.
Right.
But the compilation of it all that really takes its toll, I can see. But thank you so much for that.
My pleasure.
Yeah. And now a word from your sponsor, Mary and Friends Meeting. I want to invite everyone to our annual, not an annual, but our first of the year open house. We are having an open house on May 6th at 2:00 in the afternoon. We invite everyone in the community to come visit. We will have tours of the meeting house. We'll have tours of the burial ground and the horse sheds. And please spread the word. We'll get some flyers out, some emails and postings. But we're having a spring and a fall open house every year. And this is the first of this season. So that would be Saturday, May 6th at 2:00. Please come join us. We'll have some refreshments, some cider and cookies or something along those lines, something very Quakerly. And please join us for Meeting for Worship on a Sunday morning at 11 o'clock in the meeting house, or as we call it, First Day. But every Sunday at 11 o'clock, we are open for worship, silent worship, but we'd love to have friends and neighbors join us. And it's quite a moving experience. So thank you so much. And please consider supporting our capital campaign to help preserve Mary and Friends Meeting for another 341 years. But thank you so much for coming and joining us. And thank you, Mike. And thank you, Scott.
Thank you, Mike. Just one thing for everybody goes away. I just put in the chat the link to our YouTube page that has all of our past Know Thy Neighbor conversations, and we'll be putting Mike's up there. Now that I know how to do it, it should be up there within a day or so. So look for that, and that's the link that will get you to that page.
Great. Thank you. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.